All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining. One second, hold on. The joys of working from home right now. Just had someone else on the phone coming in. Thank you all for joining us this morning. We still have people trickling in, but we're gonna get started. And thank you everyone for joining us today. For most of you, this is probably the second session that you're joining. We're really excited to have all of you here again. For those of you who are new to the series of workshops, this is the Triangle J Regional Summit. This is our 4th year of having this summit. And we started last week. It's 5 sessions. Last week was our first one on Thursday morning with a workshop focused on local government and equity. So for those of you who are able to join, I'm sure you were as amazed by it as I was by Sharon Williams. If you weren't able to be there, we do have that recording available. So we will make sure that all of you have that afterwards because it's definitely worth listening to. So I am going to quickly do some housekeeping items before I turn it over to our introduction, the people doing introductions. Obviously, we've all been on lots of Zoom meetings, so many of these things you know, but just as a reminder, we are recording this meeting, so just be aware of that. If you're not speaking, just make sure that you are muted. You have entered the meeting muted, so it's also a note to unmute if you would like to speak because you are muted. We will be monitoring the chat box. So if you have any questions, we'd like to make this really interactive. Our presenters will have time for Q&A. So please use the chat box as we are progressing through the presenters. And we'll make sure to get to all of those questions and comments as well. If you need captions, we do also have captions available. They're not turned on, so you will have to turn them on if you want closed captions. You'll have to go to your taskbar, which is either in the bottom or top of your screen, and there will be an option called closed captions, and you can simply click that and turn it on. I will note that those are probably 80 to 85% accurate, so don't count on 100% accuracy, but they'll let you know what's going on if you're having any challenges hearing. And then just a tip, if you are having any bandwidth issues, you may want to turn off your video or call into the audio with your phone. And the instructions for the phone are in the confirmation email that you received for this meeting. So with that, I am going to turn it over for a little welcome from our organization to Lindsay Whitson, who is our Economic Development Planner.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thanks, Elena. As Elena said, my name is Lindsay Whitson, and I'm a Senior Community and Economic Development Planner with Triangle J. And first off, I wanted to start by welcoming everyone on behalf of TJCOG. We're super fortunate to have today's guest speakers with us from PolicyLink. Before we dive into our main event, I wanted to share what type of economic development work TJCOG has been conducting. Through our partnership with the Economic Development Administration, we've been designated as the Economic Development District. With this title, it allows us to provide technical assistance and facilitation, serve as an educator, and of course, we help to generate partnerships and leverage funding to help move the needle regarding economic development throughout the region. We also oversee development and implementation of the region's regional economic development strategy. And that document outlines the goals, the action plans, and the strategies for how to achieve such goals as we continue to plan for economic growth in the region. Lastly, perhaps more timely than ever, our work is also focused on economic resiliency, which is particularly prevalent in today's economy as we continue to navigate through all of the economic hardships that COVID has revealed. Before we get started also with our speakers, I did want to address, so why did TJCOG select equitable growth as a session topic? For starters, it is important for us to assess where we are as a region to be able to help identify how to leverage our strengths and fortify our weaknesses regarding the topic while we plan for future equitable economic development. But secondly, in order to obtain a higher degree of prosperity, it is important for all of our region's constituents to be able to grow both physically, socially, and economically. and to have sufficient access to things like infrastructure, healthcare, education, and workforce training. Those are all important and successful factors that contribute to economic growth. So asking ourselves, is our region growing in an equitable way, helps to lay the topic's foundation, but it is up to us to show up and enforce the policy changes, encourage viable partnerships, and create extensive engagement opportunities. And of course, to implement the hard work that will allow us to say that we are growing as equitably as a region. So again, welcome on behalf of TJCOG, and I'll turn it back over to Elena.
Thanks, Lindsay. So quickly now, we'd like to first say thank you to all of our regional summit sponsors. And then I'd like to turn over to Carl Rees, who is going to say a few remarks from Electricities, who's today's sponsor, and introduce our presenters.
Thanks, Elena and Lindsay. You all are great partners to us at the Triangle J COG and to a number of our communities, as I'll mention in a minute, but really appreciate you all putting on this series. So good morning, everybody. I'm Carl Rees, and on behalf of the Electricities Board and our CEO, Roy Jones, we are proud to help sponsor this event, and it is my pleasure to bring you greetings. As was mentioned earlier, I work as part of a small but mighty team of economic developers who work across the state of North Carolina to help bring jobs, investment, and quality of life improvements to more than 70 North Carolina municipalities. I'm joined at the event today by Ms. Brenda Jones, who manages our economic development programs as well. For those of you that are not familiar with our work, Electricities members are those towns and cities that operate their own electric grids, such as Apex, Clayton, Benson, Wake Forest, and Smithfield, all of whom are located within the Triangle J region. As you can imagine, as an organization that works with more than 70 municipalities, we see significant differences in fiscal capacity, technical capacity, as well as other resources within our communities, which unquestionably impacts the lives of the citizens within those communities. We are excited to be a part of today's discussions on growth and equity, and look forward to putting good practices and ideas that we share among this group today into action across both the Triangle J region and more broadly throughout North Carolina. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers for this session. Abby Langston is a senior associate with PolicyLink. Abby conducts research to inform and support transformative, community-driven efforts to build an equitable economy for all. As part of the All in Cities initiative, she supports the work of local leaders advancing economic and housing justice and leads the development of the All in Cities online policy toolkit. Through the research partnership between PolicyLink and the Program for Regional Environmental Equity at the University of Southern California, she collaborates with the communities across the country to produce data and analysis and make the case for racial equity. Abby joined PolicyLink as a 2015-2017 Mellon ACLS Public Fellow and previously served as the editor of the America's Tomorrow newsletter. Abby holds a PhD from the graduate program in literature at Duke University, where she specializes in American Studies and critical race and ethnic studies. James Crowder is a senior associate at PolicyLink. James is a committed advocate for policies and programs that improve the quality of life for low-income families and distressed communities of color. He brings over 10 years of experience in the field of affordable housing and community development. Most recently, he worked in the nonprofit sector as a program officer for the Philadelphia office of the Local Initiative Support Corporation, LISC. In this role, he helped draft a community-driven equitable development strategy to support residents in a gentrifying neighborhood of West Philadelphia. Prior to LISC, he worked in the private sector as a consultant with BCT Partners, providing technical assistance for cities in the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development's Choice Neighborhoods program. James has also worked in the public sector, spending 7 years in a variety of policy analyst roles with the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development. He holds a BS in Communications and a Master's in Public Policy degree from Rutgers University, as well as an MA in African American Studies from Columbia University. We look forward to the conversation today.
Thank you, Carl. And actually, before we turn it over to the fabulous presenters, I have the pleasure of helping conduct a quick poll. So We did say this is gonna be interactive, so please be prepared to answer polls and talk in the chat. This is going to help both Abby and James kind of tailor their conversation and their presentations a bit. So we wanna have you answer a quick question about the focus area that you think is most important in our region for equitable growth. So in 1 second, you're going to see a poll pop up on your screen. Please answer. Awesome, almost everyone has voted. A few more seconds. All right. I'm going to close polling now. And I'm going to share the results. So hopefully everyone can see what the results are. Some of you probably are not surprised that a lot of us said access to transportation and housing was the most important element, not far behind economic inclusion. So I'm going to stop sharing the results now and turn it over to James.
Thank you, Elena. Let me just get my screen up. It's good to see kind of where folks, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining. My name is James Crowder. I'm a senior associate at PolicyLink. It was helpful, and now I need to get this off my screen, to see where folks' thinking lies around this. I think the transportation and housing makes sense, just given the urgency that it often reveals, but it's all related. You know, the ability for folks to pay for housing or get to jobs relates to economic security. So I'm happy to have this discussion and try and tie those things together. For those that may not know, PolicyLink is a research and action institute. It was founded about 20 years ago by our Angela Glover Blackwell. We are based in Oakland, California, with offices in New York and DC, and our focus is on our approach is called lifting up what works, right? And that's basically reflects that we know that a lot of the answers to the challenges and problems that we all, spend time trying to explore and fix, the answers already lie within the communities most impacted by those challenges. And so at PolicyLink, we work with coalitions both inside and outside of government to identify what those challenges are and see what promising strategies folks have developed to address them. I'm pretty sure everyone has seen this graphic by now in 2020, but essentially it's important to make sure we're all on the same page and distinguishing equity from equality and diversity. And equity is about eliminating barriers and giving folks what they need to be able to reach their full potential. And that might entail a reallocation of resources and strategies. So I'm going to talk about 2.5 to 3 different projects that we're working on at PolicyLink that I think would be of interest to TJCOG. The first is our economic inclusion in Southern cities work. We have been, since 2015, working with 7 cities across the South to better understand how they're each advancing economic inclusion, create a cross-sector peer learning network that's primarily, it's a safe space to give folks a place to talk about the challenges that they're facing, the unique challenges in the South, given state interference or preemption, given the legacy of slavery, the unique challenges faced there. And through these meetings, they meet twice a year in rotating locations. Folks are able, we provide them with technical assistance through both speakers and additional resources, as well as a tool. We're in the process of developing equity assessment tool. But to ground this discussion, I'd like to be clear about what we consider to be economic inclusion. There's a lot of definitions out there. So for us, it's a 7-point platform, right? And I'll talk about each in detail, but the activities that comprise economic inclusion include equitable development, business development and growth of firms of color, workforce equity, wealth building, economic security and good jobs, community voice, and the actual capacity to implement economic inclusion. Sorry, my screen is... Okay, so equitable development. So what we mean by that is public investments and support for housing and community development align in a way that build community wealth, increase resilience, and prevent the displacement of low-income residents and communities of color, as well as the businesses that effectively serve them. Some examples of equitable development efforts include tenant protections. So this is things like just cause eviction legislation, so that you're passing in neighborhoods that are experiencing a lot of growth where landlords are incentivized to sell and or raise rents, then putting legislation in place that defines the acceptable grounds for a landlord to evict is one strategy that folks have used. I know Philadelphia passed something like that recently. Foreclosure prevention, how are you maintaining neighborhoods and the low-income residents, homeowners that are there? Commercial stabilization, often not left out, but towards the end of the conversation in neighborhood growth are the small mom and pop businesses that kind of define the community for so many residents. Anchor strategies, and this is a powerful one that's available to folks. How are you aligning the spending power, the hiring power of your major anchor institutions, your eds and meds? I think about the example of CASE, the Chicago Anchors for a Strong Economy, and this is a cohort of 16 different anchors that have committed to buying local. And since the initiative started, they've been able to work with 236 businesses, launch 180 new jobs, and put an additional $50.6 million in the local economy. So this is expenditures they were already going to have. There's just a commitment to eliminating barriers to give those contracts, those contracts to small local firms. That might entail rethinking about the size of the contract, right? So that smaller firms can compete for it. It might entail some TA and growth so that firms are ready to compete. But the intentionality around connecting those firms to the anchor efforts is key. Business development and growth. And how are you supporting the growth of small businesses? And whether that be through a minority business incubator for new small businesses, an accelerator for existing small businesses to grow, access to venture capital or equity capital, and or clearly identified procurement targets. In Cincinnati, they realized that in a city that was 43% Black, only 1% of city contracts were going to Black-owned businesses. And so they developed the Cincinnati Minority Business Accelerator. And since that, again, intentionality and focus on growing those businesses in the region, they've been able to triple the number of Black businesses with revenues over $10 million. Workforce equity. This is connecting folks to jobs, creating pathways to jobs that pay family-sustaining wages, and expanding opportunities for mobility of existing workers. And this can be done through efforts like a local and targeted hiring program. And I know this often meets with some type of lawsuit around local and targeted hiring efforts. And so then I invite you guys to consider how you are defining your targets, whether that be through zip codes that include a lot of low-income residents of color that are struggling to get connected to the economy, whether that be through other methods, but we have examples that we can share. New Orleans, for example, years ago had a local hiring program that was tested at the local level, but managed to survive state preemption. Dual enrollment, are high school students able to also get college credit? We recognize that everyone is not going to get a 4-year bachelor's degree, and the economy is, we often talk about the number of jobs that require a bachelor's degree, but there's also a skills gap across the country, and there are a lot of good jobs there. And so how are we setting up folks for success that are not pursuing a 4-year college degree? That include, vocational schools and how they're aligning your public education system with growing industries. What is the scope of background checks? Ban the box. Are we eliminating questions that aren't really necessary before an offer of employment is extended? And that can extend even to gender pay equity, right? Salary history bands. It's been shown that women share their salary histories up front. They often earn less money. So narrow what's asked before an offer is extended. I'm sorry, my computer. Public transit, as far as the ability for folks who don't have vehicles to get to job centers, and a first source referral program. How easy are you making it for developers or those that want to hire local residents in the community to tap into an existing vetted and screened list? Wealth building efforts. We know there's a racial wealth gap, and so ways that cities or regions can help to address that are through things like a first-time homebuyer program, alternative credit building models, right? Are you pushing landlords to report payments to Experian, Equifax, and TransUnion so that low-income residents can actually build credit profiles? That's something that cities can do. IDA programs, cooperative business ownership models. Are you preventing wealth stripping and eliminating municipal fines and fees? This is a big one. We've had a lot of media coverage of efforts to defund and invest, divest, and I won't touch that here, but I will, invite folks to consider how the degree to which city revenue is coming from fines and fees of low income or indigent folks in the community that have paid their debt to society and are trying to move on. Economic security and good jobs. This is about job quality, not just access to jobs, and how are cities and regions influencing the quality of jobs? Are you setting high standards for jobs that the cities are subsidizing, right? So city contracts. And are you requiring fair hiring, equal pay, and equitable promotion opportunities in your own workforce? These are examples. You're setting an example for private employers in the region. Community voice. Obviously, we want to center those most impacted. For it to be fully inclusive, economic inclusion must center those most impacted. And so how well is a region or city investing in organizing? How are you developing a pipeline of community leaders, residents in the community that can be called upon to represent and advocate for their neighborhoods in a meaningful way? And or participatory budgeting. Are you carving out a piece of the budget and giving residents through a process full control over how that money is spent, whether that be parks and rec funds, whether that be discretionary funds for council members for things happening in their district, but there are ways to think about empowering residents to have change in their community. And finally, the capacity to implement. Everything I've mentioned earlier is in vain if there's not an infrastructure set up for this to happen. Are you collecting and using racially disaggregated data to see the impact of the policies that are in place or that you're passing? Are folks being adequately trained and supported? You can't just create a chief equity officer position that reports to the custodian or someone's third cousin. That person has to be empowered to make change. Are they trained and supported in a way that's effective? Are you engaging in developing internal leadership? You can't just, if you want this effort to survive a mayoral administration into the next administration, you have to build that infrastructure into your city agencies. Are you devoting sufficient resources for enforcement and compliance? It's great to have a press release and a soundbite when you do pass that big policy, but then 2 years from now, how are you showing that it actually worked? And cities like Seattle has a really aggressive equitable development initiative, and they have a whole set of indicators that they track and monitor and share publicly on an annual basis so that residents can actually see, the city said they were going to do something, this is what we've done, and this is how it's impacted folks. And so it really does highlight the benefits of transparency. And developing compelling communications to mobilize broad support. there are folks that can be persuaded and folks that cannot, that will not be persuaded. What are you how are you lifting up successes that make the case? I think at the beginning of the call, Lindsay mentioned, that economic inclusion benefits the entire region. It is that business case. It's the moral. There's a moral imperative to economic inclusion and equity. There's also an economic imperative as the nation grows towards a majority people of color nation by 2044 or 2045. It's only in our best interest economically to think about how we're bringing people of color into the fold. Okay, I think I have. I'm gonna skim through because Carl, in his introduction, touched on Abby's All in Cities Policy Toolkit. I mentioned a few examples just now. I'm trying to talk at a moderate pace. I tend to talk fast, but I wanted to make sure you guys were aware of this resource with additional information just in case I talk too fast. And so the toolkit is part of our All in Cities initiative. Both Abby and I are part of that program. We recognize, we started it, I would say about 5 years ago, recognizing that, a lot of the US economy is driven by cities and that people of color are still enduring barriers to opportunity or facing displacement. And as cities continue to grow and try to face gentrification pressures, the equity imperative is only more important. And so we created a toolkit with full of online resources for folks that give folks more information around our framework. These are the 6 efforts that we think comprise what an all-in city is. And we have several of those active across the country. I mentioned Cincinnati, Sacramento, Fresno, places where we've worked with coalitions to embed equity. This is what the website looks like. And I took a deep dive around one of the newest tools that we just put up there, reforming inequitable court fines and fees. And so the toolkit outlines, what the policy is, right? Why should folks care about this? Who is responsible for implementing fines and fees or whatever policy you're reviewing in the toolkit? And what should cities or regions that are considering implementing this, what should they be aware of? And so where is it working, right? And so the toolkit mentions Benton County, Washington, where they were driven to revisit the way that courts collect fines and fees after a 2015 lawsuit. Montgomery, Alabama got rid of their fines and fees and instituted a presumption of indigence, right? And so put the burden of proof off of those in the system and give a presumption of indigence that mitigated their fines and fees that were assessed. And then Leon County, Florida, again, the business case for this, you're spending more money, in many cases, you're spending more money trying to enforce outstanding fines and fees of low-income residents that just don't have it than you're actually getting back. And so is it a good use of resources to spend that much money trying to collect something that's not there? And I'm gonna keep going. Alinda, I'm looking at you. Give me a sign. And so the last thing I'm going to talk about is our employment equity in southern states. This is a project that we did in North Carolina, as well as some other states. I think you guys probably care about less. But Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Mississippi, sponsored by the Kellogg Foundation, and asked the question, right, speaking about barriers to employment and access to quality jobs, what would it look like? What would the economic impact be if everyone who wanted to get a job can get a job? Even when we talk about the height of the full employment in the early 2000s, even then, the unemployment rate for Black people was still always double what it is for white folks. Why is that? How can we start to think about addressing that? And so we worked in these 5 states with coalitions driven by advisory committees that were set up by strong partner organizations. And so in North Carolina, we worked with the North Carolina Budget and Tax Center. I don't think Alexandra Sorota's on here, but shout out to her for being an awesome partner, as well as the Foundation for Health, Leadership and Innovation, Rural Forward. There, Calvin Allen and his team were great. We had a focus on the rural parts of North Carolina, given the unique challenges they faced accessing employment. And so we did several focus groups, as well as some outside research to make the case. I think I just already said all that. And the focus groups were in Lumberton, Rocky Mount, and Eden. And some of the recurring themes that came up in North Carolina was around the use of temporary workers and the challenges that poses for folks that are trying to get quality long-term employment. That's something the Budget and Tax Center has been focused on. It kind of depresses the economy when you're, or the ability for folks to ask for living wage when the proliferation of temporary workers kind of prevents that. Folks talked about the fairness of the hiring process and the old boys network of how, that's present and how hard it is to get your foot in the door. In the rural parts of North Carolina, access to reliable and affordable transportation was a big challenge. I heard about this van services that people pay or that the company might institute to get low-income workers to work, but then those funds are coming out of their paycheck. So you're already earning a lower wage because you're a temporary worker, and now you're paying even more of that of your paycheck for transportation to get to work. But if these are the only options available, you're going to do what you have to do. Access to childcare is a recurring issue, the wages that are paid, and the availability of workforce training. And so how do you grow in your job? Folks talked about that. And so again, back to what Lindsay talked about, the benefits, right? The economic case for inclusion. In our analysis, just looking at the rural North Carolina, if we were able to bring all people of color to the same income distribution as white men, that means knowing that not everybody is going to have a 4-year degree, not everyone's going to be making that big money, but the income distribution for white men. If we put all people of color into that same income distribution, right? So the same number of wealthy folks, the same number of poor folks, some same salaries on one hand for high salaries and low salaries. If we just did that, if you had almost 146,000 more workers would be employed, almost 56,000 fewer residents living in poverty, and the state revenue, additional 1.1 billion in state revenue. It would also cause a decrease in unemployment, particularly it looks like for Asian women, Black men, and men that identify as more than one race. And it would increase the labor force, right? Particularly for Latinx women and Black women that are often left behind. And, it's not just the rural areas that would benefit. As people have more money to spend, then the whole economy of the state grows. And so even just focusing on the rural areas of the state would have these impacts for the major metropolitan centers like Asheville, Charlotte, Durham, et cetera. I will stop there and see if there are any questions. I will proactively ask that if there's questions about methodology, I will try my best to answer, but I'm also happy to share our the well-written methodology that our partners at the University of Southern California's Program for Environmental and Regional Equity have written up, who did this analysis for us. I'm happy to try and share that too. But I can answer any questions that folks might have now before I turn it over to Abby. Thank you. And I'll stop
So if anyone
sharing.
oh, sorry, James. If anyone has a question, feel free to put it in the chat, or you can raise your hand as well.
And I can.
Oh yeah, go ahead, James.
I was going to say, if we, was the info.
So we have one question, James.
Sure.
Do resources also include information on how to gain community and political support for initiatives?
We do have some examples like that. Obviously, what worked last year pre-COVID, it may not work as well now in terms of engaging community members. But it's about building trust, right? And starting with those most impacted. Little things like, when are you holding your meetings, right? Like, are you holding them in the middle of the workday and expecting people to show up? Are you providing food if you're having meetings at dinner time? childcare, things that allow people to participate meaningfully. How are you providing information so that folks can participate in an informed and meaningful way? We had a project in Philly around a rail park, and it was working with the Chinatown CDC. And so then we have multiple languages, and you're trying to explain zoning and green infrastructure projects to folks. And so we came up with like a science fair style setup where folks walked in, you had things translated into multiple languages. It talked about A, what does equity mean, right? And then B, what is our vision for this rail park development? What are the concerns we should think about? That level of detail had to go into planning for an effective meeting. Where are we going to have the translator, the interpreter, so that they're able to easily pass information along to folks who may not speak English as a first language. So focusing on the barriers that folks might face to participate meaningfully, information, distractions, things like that, I would say is how you start to get community support around issues. You have to show them there's a reason for them to trust that this effort will be different than those in the past that was often very extractive, where you ask communities for their opinions and then what happens doesn't reflect that. I see a question about full employment as a good goal. How are jobs created? And so I already talked about some of the strategies that could be used as far as leveraging city dollars and resources that are already being spent, right? And so the Memphis Medical District, I don't know if I touched on that, is an example. It's a collaborative. Those are private. Those are anchors, but at the same time, there's an organization that is responsible for coordinating their procurement needs and instituting a buy local, hire local strategy. And just from someone being able to hand them, oh, here is a framework for what a hire local, buy local strategy looks like. Here is, we're going to develop a workforce training program that is going to meet with the anchors. What do they need in terms of skills and requirements to be able to get what they need done? And then you have someone that's training folks, getting them ready. So now you have folks in the community able to get these jobs. It does require, I think on the startup, a backbone organization or someone to do that inventory to make it easy for folks. But those are just an example. Yeah. Can I further explain?
2 more questions, James.
Yep. I'm going through. Can you speak to the similarities and differences between large and small communities? Great question. We're going through an effort right now working with folks upstate New York, developing anti-displacement strategies. And I can tell you that developing an anti-displacement strategy in Ithaca, New York is different than San Francisco, California. The housing market is just different. The tax base is different. The job market is different. Those are all and the political landscape is different. And so, I can speak to, those are some obvious examples, but it's also can push innovation, right? And so I know that folks in thinking about, this is not necessarily economic inclusion, this is thinking about small cities and communities, using hotels to get homeless folks, families facing homelessness off the streets. The ability to do that in a small town is a little bit easier. The conversation about, okay, now that we have this hotel, we might want to think about doing something else with it. Those are different conversations in a small town than a large town. It's not the best answer. I may want to draft something to you, Brett, on that. Jennifer, can I further explain what racially disaggregated data is? I sure can, but Abby's going to do it in much better job of that. And so when you think about an impact, so an example, COVID, right? COVID-19, and who it's impacting when the pandemic first hit, and we were hearing, oh, it's a lot of seniors and older folks. And then a few weeks later, the headline was that, oh, it's clear that African-American, Latinx, and Native American folks are getting this hit harder. And why? If folks were not looking at the data to see which groups were impacted more than others, that never would have come out. Racially disaggregated data isn't always readily available. that I think a data gathering agenda can be a powerful thing too. Again, the cities in upstate New York that are looking at anti-displacement, one of the biggest challenges is around the black hole that is eviction data. It's often not publicly available. It's hard to get access to. And so how do you develop an eviction prevention program if you don't have access to the data? And so, I invite folks to consider how much you invest in collecting data to inform policies. Don't not explore policies. Don't let a lack of data be a end of the conversation. Let it be the start to, okay, what do we need to collect to actually get to that point? And thank you, Melissa. I appreciate that. Elena, so I'm gonna turn it back over to you. I can keep talking, but I can stop.
No, I think we're right on time to move forward. And I think it was actually a good turning point because the conversation's shifting to data, which I think Abby is going to talk more about. So I will start by, we're going to do another poll before I turn it over to Abby. I know we've last session as well and this session, there's a lot of conversation about the importance of data in equity work. And so just before Abby starts talking about some of the tools that they have available for communities to use, as well as just ways to use the data, we want to know, and I'm going to put the poll up right now, we want to know how you feel your current data capacity and capability is. So I'm about to launch a poll. You should see it any minute. So take a moment to just quickly respond. %75% of you have voted. Keep going. Or answered. I guess it's not a vote. All right. 5 seconds. And all right. So I'm going to share the results. This is what you all said. Pretty even distribution, I guess. The majority, or 42% of you, said somewhat strong or robust, and then some other communities all across the spectrum of their data capacity. So, awesome. All right, I'm gonna stop sharing. Abby, it's your turn.
Wonderful, thank you, Elena, and thank you, James. I was noticing in the slide with our headshots while Carl was sharing our bios that my hair has gotten equally short as yours has gotten long from when those photos were taken.
Very true.
It's wonderful to see you. James is in Philadelphia. I'm based in Oakland, California. And so it's nice to have an opportunity to connect. And I am really thrilled to be with all of you because as a 15-year former resident of the Triangle, I lived in Durham and Chapel Hill and up in Creedmoor. And so always have a soft spot for having these conversations in and about the Triangle, which I consider my adopted home. I didn't grow up there, but it's very much a part of who I am. So I'm really happy to be here with you all today. One other quick personal note, I have a very senior dog sleeping underneath my feet. So if you hear a random snorting sound in the middle of this conversation, just know that that's her and I'll make sure she's taken care of. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. And I love this question about what is disaggregated data, thinking about what your organizational capacities are around data, because that is the bulk of my work. And it's something that I'm really happy to be able to share with you today. So as Carl mentioned, I am part of the team at PolicyLink that manages the National Equity Atlas, which is an online data tool that we produce in partnership with the Equity Research Institute at the University of Southern California. We've been working with them for about 10 years and have this very powerful online data tool that we make freely available. We are constantly adding new data, adding new geographies, and think that it's can be a really helpful piece of infrastructure for that last part of what an equitable development or economic inclusion agenda looks like that James shared around building capacity and being able to collect and utilize disaggregated data. We know that a lot of organizations, if they're community organizations or businesses or governments, particularly in some smaller places, don't necessarily have the resources and capacity to do all of that work on their own. It's very labor intensive, it can be very technical, and so we try to kind of fill that gap where we can. We consider the Atlas to be America's report card on racial and economic equity. So we have about 30 different indicators for 300 different geographies across the country. And if you were to go through and count up all the different ways that we can cut that data, we can look at it by race, ethnicity, we can look by gender, by age, by nativity, which is comparing whether folks are immigrant or US born. There are millions of charts in here. And so we consider it a comprehensive report card that can give you a sense of the state of racial equity in your place and help you dig into those priority issues and priority populations that you might want to focus your economic inclusion and equitable development efforts toward. So I'm going to give you just a quick tour of what's here, and then we'll actually look at some of the data for the Triangle region and talk a little bit more about how it can be useful. So the homepage of the Atlas that you see here includes sort of an overview of our work. This is our indicators database, which is really the powerhouse of the site. This is where you can access data on all of the different indicators that we have available. We also perform our own research. So we conduct original research that we think is important to inform the field, to influence policy debates, to provide context for some of these conversations, you know, even the questions that you all were raising in the chat after James's presentation. So we have our own research agenda, but then we also partner with local communities to produce tailored analyses that could be a network of organizations that are working on a particular policy campaign, for example, around eviction moratoriums, which is an important issue right now in the context of COVID, and we've been providing some data support there. Or it could be government organizations who are really trying to understand the baseline state of equity across a range of issues in their place. So we also work really closely in partnership with local groups on the ground at the city level, the regional level, sometimes the state level, to produce those tailored analyses. So all of that information will be found here in our research tab. And then we also have data in action. So we know that there are a lot of different campaigns and organizations that use our data, even if we don't know about it ahead of time, because we want to make it freely available. And we report on the impact that our data has been able to have. So you can find a lot of things here. And I want to just point out quickly, and we'll be sure to share this in the follow-up email as well, that under the training menu here, we have several introductory webinars, we have a couple of blog posts, we have lots of resources available to help folks navigate the Atlas. We know it we try to make it as user-friendly as possible, but there's a lot of information and a lot going on. So if during this presentation you find yourself a little turned around, just know that we have good resources here to help you find the data that you're looking for. So with that, I want to dig in a little bit and look at some of the indicators that we have available. So our framework basically has three key insights that inform the data work that we do. Number one, systemic racism is an urgent challenge across systems, across communities, everywhere in this country. We know that this is a growing challenge because of our changing demographics. As James mentioned, we're going to have a people of color majority within a generation. In some places we already do. Some places are ahead of that curve. Some will take a little bit longer, but at the national level, we're looking at about 25 years from now. And because there are systemic barriers and structures that prevent many people of color from succeeding and reaching their full potential, as they become a larger share of the population, that is a bigger and bigger challenge for our entire nation and for our entire communities, not just morally, not just because inclusion is the morally right thing to do, but also economically. If you think about levels of school poverty and neighborhood poverty, which are part of the legacy of redlining and residential segregation. And you think about the challenges that that can set up for people as they proceed through their life course. If you think about inequities in the criminal justice system or in wages, and understand that a larger and larger share of the population are subject to those challenges, it becomes pretty easy to see that they're going to have negative consequences for everyone. And so we say equity then is the antidote. Equity is actually the superior growth model, not just for moral reasons, but also as an economic imperative. And so with that in mind, we put together this set of indicators that we think are a really important way to tell this story at the local level. The first set is around demographics. So understanding who is in your community, how is that changing? What's the population mix, and how is that going to impact these different issues that you're working on in terms of economic development, community development, and inclusion. Then we look at economic vitality, which has two components. The first is, how is the economy doing overall? When we're looking at job growth and income growth, business ownership, these kinds of questions. But then also, how are the people who live in that economy doing, right? Are wages becoming more equitable? Is income growth being shared? Is the prosperity being shared? And so we have both the kind of broad economic indicators and also people-focused indicators. Then readiness, which you might think of as kind of our human capital, maybe, set of indicators. So looking at whether or not residents are being adequately prepared and have access to the resources they need to connect to the economy. So we're looking here at education, at connection to work, and then the sort of health indicators and life outcomes that people experience with life expectancy. Then connectedness, these you might think of as sort of the place-based indicators. So if these are about people, these are about place. I know that in our first poll, the overriding concern you all are thinking about today is access to transportation and housing. And you'll see that sort of the first few indicators here are about exactly those issues. So understanding whether people are able to connect to the assets of the region. Are they able to live and afford to live in a place that's close to jobs and schools and other resources? Do they have access to reasonable transportation so that they can get to and from work or school or childcare centers? And then also looking at the kind of quality of neighborhoods that people are living in with neighborhood poverty and air pollution exposure. And then finally, coming back around to the question of how equity benefits everyone, we have a couple of indicators on economic benefits. And this is sort of the signature analysis of the Atlas. It's one of the really unique contributions that we bring in being able to quantify exactly how much of a difference equity would make. So when we talk about racial equity in income, that would mean closing racial gaps both in employment and in wages, right? So as James described earlier, understanding that there are different educational levels and different age structures within different racial groups. If everyone made the same wages and was employed at the same levels across those different cohorts, how much stronger would the economy be? For the US as a whole, this number is into the multiple trillions, about $2.3 trillion. We did an analysis, a custom analysis of the Triangle area several years ago in partnership with TJCOG and the Qatar Council of Governments, and found that for the Triangle region, in 1 year alone, racial inequities in income were costing the regional economy about $22 billion. So it's pretty easy to see that this is a shared concern, and that there should be a really strong incentive to advance equity for everyone. So I wanted to look at just a couple of these, show you how the Atlas works. We're not going to be able to dig into all of these things for the region today, but I just want to give you a sense of how to access it. And we'll talk a little bit more about what disaggregated data means. So the first thing we'll look at here is race ethnicity. And again, this is around just getting a sense of who's in the community. I will note that our geographies are kind of limited to the federally defined metropolitan statistical areas. So we have several here that will be relevant to you all. I'm starting here with Raleigh-Cary, which I believe is Wake, Johnston, and Franklin counties. There is also a geography or a region here that's called Durham. That is Durham and Orange County, and maybe one other. Just as an FYI, but you can get all the definitions for what these places are in the atlas. We have everything defined here for you. So if we're looking at the change in demographics over time, you can see that in 1980, this Raleigh-Cary region was more than 3/4 white. Now it is about 60%. So that's a pretty dramatic change over the last few decades. And then you can get a sense of which groups are growing and contributing to that growth. So this is an important place to start among our demographic indicators, all of the ones that you see listed here, just to understand who is in your population. And you can take a look here to see very specifically which groups are driving growth, to understand how this diversity is increasing. There are a handful of other demographic indicators here that might be of interest to you, but for the sake of time, I want us to kind of dig in on a couple of the issue-based indicators. So under economic vitality, I want to look at the working poor indicator. And what this shows is the share of workers by race and ethnicity who are economically insecure. We define that as having an income below 200% of the federal poverty level. And you can look at this specifically for full-time workers or for all workers. So I want to look at full-time workers. And what this is showing us is the share of workers by race ethnicity who are working full-time and are still economically insecure in this metro region. This is what racially disaggregated data looks like. So if I were to say in Raleigh-Cary, overall, 12% of full-time workers are economically insecure. That sounds like a lot. Nobody who's working full-time should be economically insecure, right? But when we disaggregate and look at that by race ethnicity, we find even bigger gaps, and we find some kind of really sort of shocking differences in this experience. So for white workers, 6% of full-time workers are economically insecure. But if you look at the Latinx population, 41%, 2 out of 5 full-time workers are still economically insecure. 1 out of 5 Black full-time workers. And so this is the power of disaggregated data to help us begin to understand and to identify what those differences in experience are, how race layers into the economic outcomes that people are experiencing, so that we can develop targeted strategies and solutions to help close these gaps, to help achieve racial equity. So we can, this is for Raleigh-Cary, which again I said was Wake, Franklin, and Johnston counties. You might wonder, okay, how does this look in a different part of the Triangle region? So what we're going to do is compare that to Durham. And what you see here, so now we're looking at Raleigh-Cary region in orange and the Durham region in gray. Those gaps that we saw are actually even larger in Durham. So in the Durham region, 48% of full-time Latinx workers are economically insecure. We could further look at this if we wanted to by nativity. So you might wonder, what's the difference for US born versus immigrant workers? And you can see that here in this breakdown. So I know I'm moving pretty quickly through this because I want to get to have some time for questions, and just a reminder that there are some training materials available here to show you how to find all this data. I wanted to just plan to spend more of our time actually looking at the data together. So don't worry, we got you covered, and I'm more than happy to hear from you if you want to reach out directly to learn more about how to use this tool, just as a side note. So this is one of the kind of people-focused economic indicators that we have, but I know for folks working in economic development and working at the level that many of you are, it's also helpful to have a broader view of what's happening in the economy as a whole. So I want to look at a couple of those types of indicators, which are also under the economic vitality list. So first, let's look at job and wage growth. And this is very impressive. I spend a lot of time looking at this data for different regions. I'm not sure exactly what well, I guess we can check. We can see how Raleigh compares to other regions. So job growth in Raleigh-Cary was number 6 out of the 150 largest regions in the US. Really impressive overall job growth numbers that we're seeing here. You can see that most of that has actually been in high wage jobs. The least in middle wage jobs, which is a trend that we see pretty consistently across the country, this kind of hollowing of the middle, although it's hard to call it hollowing when you have almost 100% growth from 1990 to 2018 in those middle wage jobs. So you see really strong economic growth based on these jobs numbers over the last few decades and understanding how jobs are increasing and growing in the region. So this is a sign of a really kind of strong economic growth, strong trends, but it doesn't give you a sense of the differences in the ways that different kinds of workers and different populations are experiencing that. So if we keep these numbers in mind, which are very impressive, then let's look at income growth. And so over that time period where we've seen 150% growth in jobs, who has actually been benefiting from income growth and those kind of productivity gains and prosperity gains? And so here we're looking at the percent of income growth for workers by the wage distribution. So workers at the 10th percentile, the bottom 10% in the wage distribution, have seen 0 income growth since 1980. These are inflation adjusted dollars, and in 2017 dollars, they have seen no growth in wages, while those at the top 10% have seen 40% growth. So this is kind of an important way to begin to layer on to the overall economic development metrics, the job growth numbers, the wage growth numbers, to understand who's actually benefiting from that. And then if we want to dig in a little bit further, we can say, okay, what are the actual median wages that people are earning? And again, we can see this, we'll see this data disaggregated by race and ethnicity. So we'll see the overall median wages for the region, and then we'll be able to see the median wages for workers of each different racial ethnic group. So we start here with a trend line over time that shows pretty marked growth. And again, this gray line is for white workers, a little bit flatter growth for workers of color. But then we can really dig in and see what that looks like for different racial ethnic groups. So an overall median wage of $24 an hour, it's a couple dollars higher than that for white workers and pretty significantly lower for Black and Latinx workers. We always try to provide the raw numbers here so that people can understand exactly what the scope of the population is that they're looking at. And then you might wonder, how does gender layer into this? We think a lot about gender wage inequities, and so we can also look at this data by both race and gender at the same time to understand the overall impact of gender and how it kind of interacts with race here. So what we see, these gray bars are for male workers and the teal are for female. And we see that for almost every group, men earn pretty significantly more than women. It's actually not true among Latinx workers, and the gap is smaller for Black workers. So we can begin to see like the different issues and kind of overlaps that create the outcomes we're seeing. James was talking about transportation and access to childcare and understanding household composition and how that impacts these issues.
Hey, Abby.
Yes.
We've got one question that I think
sure.
you might want to talk through. Are job growth numbers calibrated for overall population growth?
So the job numbers are specifically around the actual employment in the place. So it's not jobs per resident or residents per job. It's a great question though, and let me actually go back to that indicator to show you one thing. If you are find yourself looking at a chart in the atlas and you're not quite sure what it is, I can expand this a little bit. There are two kind of easy ways to get a better sense of it. The first is to click on what it shows and why it matters, which will kind of give you a snapshot of why we even bothered to include this in the atlas. And then there's this blue question mark here right next to the indicator name. And this will both give you a quick overview of what the indicator is showing, but it will also link you to our methods. So if you are a data nerd like me and really want to dig into where did these numbers come from, what were the calculations that we used, then you can click here to learn more about that. So if you have those kinds of questions, we try to make it really easy for folks to find the answers to them. All right, so I promise I'm gonna stop in just a minute, but I wanna make sure to show you a couple of the connectedness indicators because those were that was the prime issue that folks identified as being important for equitable growth in your region. So I wanna look at housing burden. Housing burden indicates the share of households who are paying too much money for rent or for their mortgage payment if you're looking at owners. Housing burden is generally defined as spending more than 30% of your income on housing costs. That's sort of the affordability threshold that we're measuring for here. And so if we want to look, again, we're in this Raleigh-Cary metro, but we can look at Durham, we could look at the state of North Carolina. There are a few other regions that we have data for by race ethnicity. You'll see here that overall 44% of renters spend too much money on rent. There are some pretty substantial racial differences in that rate, which makes sense when we've already looked at the racial differences in income, right? Because obviously when you have more income, you're less likely to be rent burdened. You can also look at this by gender, by nativity, lots of different ways. You can also look at this and several other of our indicators in a map view. And this is a really cool feature of the atlas so that you can actually see some of the geographic unevenness of these experiences. So you can see if we look, where should we go? If you look at a couple of kind of neighboring tracts in Durham, you'll see this sort of like central Durham, we have 70% of residents are rent burdened compared to just 40% in a neighboring tract. I'm not sure exactly where this is. I need to brush up on my triangle geography, but we have an 83% rent burden rate, which is pretty astronomical. And we can do the same here in Raleigh and understand, you know, neighborhood by neighborhood, what the experience is of housing affordability and housing access. This is another indicator you can look at by gender, and this reveals pretty quickly that households that are headed by women are considerably more likely to be rent burdened than households that are headed by men across all racial ethnic groups. So there are a lot of different ways to dig into this. And then in thinking about transportation, maybe I'll go to Durham for this one. We've been looking at Raleigh-Cary mostly. Particularly in a place like the Triangle, understanding the importance of having access to a car and in order to be able to take advantage of opportunities is a really important issue. And so here you can look at the share of households who do not have a car. Overall, it's about 7%. So that's always where we begin, that aggregate number. But among Black households, 15% do not have access to a vehicle. And when you think about where folks are living, where there is affordable housing, where there is access to transit, and then where jobs are, the importance of transportation becomes pretty clear pretty quickly. This is another issue, once again, where we see that households headed by women are even less likely to have a vehicle across all of these racial ethnic groups. And so when you think about all of the indicators that are available in the atlas and the way you can piece these things together, we know that data is a really important tool for thinking about implementation, for developing solutions that are really going to work for the people who are most impacted. And so on every single indicator page that you see here in the Atlas, in addition to the data, which we know is kind of the fun part for people to play around with, we also offer our analysis of what's driving these inequities. What are the root causes that really need to be addressed if we want to see the needle move on these indicators? And then what are the strategies that different places have either implemented or we believe have a lot of promise as innovative solutions to really make some progress. And so for every indicator here, you'll see the drivers of inequity, the strategies that we want to lift up, and then at least one example of a place where one of these strategies has been implemented and has seen some good results. So we know that the data is important, but it's not the most important thing. It ought to be understood as a tool for getting to solutions, for getting to change. Not just measuring trends in and of itself is not that interesting to us. We want to measure trends in order to be able to make a measurable impact. And so on that Atlas here, you'll also find strategies related to each indicator. Two more super quick things. I think that Lena mentioned in the chat the profile that we had put together of the Research Triangle region as self-defined, the self-defined region with TJCOG and the Currituck Regional Council. So we'll make sure that you have a link to this in the chat or in follow-up. This is a very in-depth overview and analysis of not just the indicators that are actually in the National Equity Atlas, but also several other indicators. And so if you want to dig in and really understand, what the kind of baseline is in the region, this is a good place to go. And then I also wanted to share this news story from North Carolina News Daily. We recently released what we call the Racial Equity Index, which is kind of a specialized tool that lives within the National Equity Atlas. And they were kind enough to write a very in-depth comparison of how the index works for 3 cities in cities. I didn't know if they did cities, regions, for Charlotte, Raleigh, and Greensboro. So we'll share this link with you as well. It's a nice introduction to how the index works and really digs into kind of what the state of equitable growth is in these North Carolina cities. I could easily take the entire rest of your Thursday talking about this stuff, but I want to stop and check in the chat or if folks have hands raised for any questions. I'm going to keep sharing my screen for a moment in case there are specific things we want to look at to answer the questions, and then if not, I'll take it down so we can all see each other better.
Perfect. There is one question, Abby, in the chat. I don't know if you can see it or if you'd like me to read it out, but it's related to housing burden. Knowing the percent of residents who pay more than 30% of their income on rent is a good start. Does data exist to tell us how much more and that distribution? For example, are folks in a neighborhood paying 35% or 69%, since that matters?
Yeah, that it matters a lot. It also matters how much disposable income folks have, right? So it's one thing to be rent burdened because you're making minimum wage and paying market rent. It's another thing to be rent burdened because you bring in $10,000 a month and you happen to spend 35 of it on your luxury condo, right? So we know that this is, it's not the only data that you need to understand housing costs and housing affordability. So there's one other way to look at this in the Atlas, which is severity. And if you look at severe rent burden, this is going to show you the number of renters who are paying more than 50% of their income on rent. So 30% is the kind of baseline for housing burden, 50% is severely burdened. And you can also look at this if you want to understand, okay, how are people at different income levels experiencing this? You can look at the poverty status here. And this is maybe not entirely intuitive, but it's named this way because these are kind of the technical appropriate names for these categories. You might remember that I said we use below 200% of poverty as a threshold for economic insecurity. And so if we were to select this, we're going to see the numbers just for people whose household income is less than 200% of poverty. For a single person, that's about $24,000 a year. For a family of 4, it's like $49,000 a year. And that's, what we consider kind of the minimum living household income. So if we're looking at economically insecure households who pay more than 50% of their income on rent, you can see that these numbers are pretty staggering. They're much larger than the overall housing burden numbers. You can also compare this for renters versus owners. So here we're looking at economically insecure homeowners who are paying more than 50%. So there are lots of different ways to combine this data to kind of get a closer approximation of the population and the experience that you're interested in. I will also say that outside of the atlas, there are data sources or analyses that talk about housing affordability. We're actually getting ready to publish one such analysis that compares actual incomes to market rents by neighborhood. So that is, I think it gives a closer sense of what you are talking about. I'm not Jay Bedford in terms of understanding exactly the level of burden that people are experiencing. It's a great question.
We have one other question from Ellen Reckhow. Why is the most recent year 2017?
Yeah, good question. So the most recent data, we use largely federal data sources because we want our data to be comparable across all of the places included in the atlas, which are the US as a whole, all 50 states, the 150 largest metro regions, and the 100 largest cities. And so the federal data, there's always a lag in being able to process the American Community Survey is what it's called. It takes millions and millions of samples a year that have to get processed and collated. And then because we want to provide this really deep disaggregation, we use what's known as the microdata. And so we're always at least 2 years behind whatever the current calendar date is, right? So the data for 2019, for example, will be released federally sometime shortly. We have, because we want to be able to combine things like educational attainment or rent burden, along with things like race, gender, ethnicity, ancestry, it takes a long time to process that. And so we will be updating our database to 2019 data sometime in the first quarter, maybe early second quarter of next year. I know that it's really nice to have things that look like they are completely up to date. But if you look at a lot of these, well, this is a bad example actually, but if you look at a lot of our data, you'll see that there aren't actually big swings, over time in terms of many of the indicators that we're looking at. So if you're looking, for example, at unemployment, that changes pretty rapidly just on a month-to-month basis, right? But if you're looking at median wages, for example, there's not a whole lot of variation, even going back to 2000. And so we see this less as an up to the minute, this is your go-to source for what's happening on the ground right now, and more about making the case for large structural systemic changes, because these are obviously very deeply ingrained and deeply embedded inequities, which is the reason why we see over time that things haven't actually gotten better. So it's both a technical reason and sort of a philosophical reason. Ellen.
Does anyone else have any questions for Abby or James about the atlas or? So we have a question from Hannah. How has the Atlas been used in practice?
Thank you, Hannah. We have, as I mentioned, we began partnering with USC about 10 years ago, actually launched the Atlas in 2014 because we knew we were onto something when we figured out how to do this depth of disaggregation and wanted to make that more broadly available to community organizations, to other institutions, to really help folks make use of this data. So we have on the Atlas website, we have an impact session that kind of details some of these things more deeply, but a couple of examples that I will lift up. Very recently, we have been analyzing data on eviction risk. We know that so many people have experienced a loss of income and then also experienced the loss of supports, you know, the federal unemployment bump up that a lot of people had. Jobs are not recovering quickly in a lot of places. The county that I live in, you still can't go get your hair and nails done. You can't go to a restaurant. And so we knew that there was a very high risk of a lot of folks being displaced from their homes because of this income loss. And so we put together fact sheets in partnership with community coalitions that were organizing around this issue. And one of the first victories that we saw was here in Contra Costa County here in California. Our data was actually used to help make the case that convinced the County Board of Supervisors to extend the eviction moratorium to help keep people in their homes. So there are some of those immediate short-term interventions that we have been involved with. There are also longer-term initiatives. So in Fairfax County, Virginia, we did an equitable growth profile and worked with both government and community-based organizations there that actually led to the county and the school district adopting what they call the One Fairfax policy, which is about embedding racial equity across all policies and systems within the county and the school board. We have worked with many different foundations to kind of develop an equity lens and strategy in their engagement, in their funding. So it sort of goes across the board, and I will, while we're still here together, I will pull up the link to our impact section so you can take a look at some of those other things.
So while Abby is doing that, I just wanted to note that Sharon from Wake County did share a tool that they have, and I would make a note that if any, more information is better. So if any of your communities have a tool or a resource that you would like to share when we share out all the resources from PolicyLink, please feel free to send in the chat or send along later, and I will also include those.
And if anyone else has a question, we'll prioritize you. But if you don't, I have a question that I would love to ask. So I'll throw it out there and we'll see what you think. The Atlas is really a living resource. We're constantly updating it. We are looking for new indicators that would be valuable. We're getting ready to add new geographies. So a lot of folks have said the cities and the regions are helpful, but what I really need is data for my county. So we're going to be adding 400 counties to the database in the next 6 months or so probably. And some of the really big improvements have actually come from feedback that we've gotten from communities. So when we first debuted the Atlas and we're showing the data that you can look at by race, ethnicity, there was a woman in the audience who said, "This is great, but Asian or Pacific Islander is too much. That encompasses so much diversity, so many different experiences. You have to do better than that. You have to figure out how to get underneath that level." And so we took that to heart, and it took us a little while, but we actually did figure out how to do that. And so now, not only for the Asian or Pacific Islander racial category, but for all racial groups in the Atlas, you can see our data by ancestry. So we know that the white category as defined by the census includes, people of French descent and Middle Eastern and North African folks and, a whole broad range of people. The experience of Ukrainian immigrants is not the same thing as the experience of US born whites whose families have been here for 250 years, right? So for all racial groups, we now have that. We are beginning to look into and figure out how to put together some cuts of data based on ability and folks with disabilities as you know, responsive to community needs. And so I would love to know if there is something, if there's an indicator or a kind of data that you really wish you had access to or you think belongs here. I would love to hear that. Oh, Elaine, I think you're on mute.
Oh, thank you. What I was saying was, if you have an answer to Abby, feel free to put it in the chat. You can also connect with her afterwards. We'll make sure to include her contact information after with all of the other resources. So Abby and James are great, so feel free to try and steal some time from them for more questions. So we only have a couple of minutes left, so I just want to make sure that we end on time. If you do have any last minute questions, feel free to put those in the chat quickly. And then I think we're going to just start doing some closing remarks in case there are no more questions for now. So thank you, Abby and James, for all of your guidance and resources today. And we will make sure, as I put in the chat, we will send out the recording of this session, the PowerPoint from this session, and a list of all the resources that were discussed today. So you will be able to get all of those in an email that will come out after this session. Just a couple of things coming in the next 3 weeks. We have 3 more sessions for the Regional Summit. Next week will be on health equity. Obviously, we're in the midst of a pandemic, and that's really brought to light some of the challenges in the support systems and potentially views that we have of some of our more vulnerable community members. So we will have some speakers talking about the ways broadly in North Carolina and then more community specific that they're trying to improve equity in their health systems. So that's next week's session. And then the following 2 sessions will be on community engagement, which is one that's been talked about a lot, and policing. So thank you all so much. And it was great to have you. We'll see you soon.